The morning Agnes Holt told Clara Merritt to get off the porch and go back to wherever she came from, she didn't bother lowering her voice. She said it loud enough for the two ranch hands near the fence to hear, loud enough for little B, who was peering around the door frame with one bare foot curled over the other, to hear every word. We don't need a stranger running this household. Gideon's children don't need a woman who answered a newspaper advertisement like she was applying for a job at a dry goods store. You don't belong here. You never will. Clara stood on that porch holding her carpet bag with both hands. She didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened in a way that told you she'd been spoken to like that before and that she was very tired of it. If that had been you standing there, would you have turned around and walked away? Before you answer, stay with this story. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time. Because the stories we tell here are the kind that stay with you long after they end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that porch. Because what happened next changed everything. The stage depot in Harlan Creek was a single room with a potbelly stove that hadn't been cleaned since the previous winter and a hand-lettered sign above the door that read, "Passengers wait here," as though there were somewhere else they might go. Clara Merritt had been sitting on the wooden bench inside that room for 40 minutes, and in that time, 3 different people had looked at her the way people look at something unexpected. A crack in a window pane, a bird that flew inside. They stared and then looked away, and she pretended not to notice. She was 34 years old, not young, not old, but sitting somewhere in the uncomfortable middle that the world tends to view as a woman who had her chances and didn't take them correctly. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped conversation. She was the kind of plain that became something else once you paid attention, once you noticed her hands, which moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who never wasted motion, or her eyes, which were the color of creek water in October, and watched everything without appearing to. She had one carpet bag. Inside it, 2 dresses, a pair of boots that needed new heels, her mother's recipe book with the spine held together by kitchen twine, and a letter folded into quarters and worn soft at the creases from too much handling. The letter was from the Harlan Matrimonial Bureau of the Western Territories, and it confirmed her arrangement with one Gideon Holt of Harlan Creek, Montana, widower, rancher, father of 7 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16. The letter used words like practical arrangement and mutual benefit and household management, which was the Bureau's way of saying, here is a man who needs someone to hold his life together, and here is a woman who needs somewhere to go. Clara had read it so many times she could recite it, and she still wasn't sure whether it was a rescue or a sentence. The stage driver opened the depot door and said, "Anyone waiting on the Holt Ranch pickup?" And Clara picked up her bag and followed him out into the cold. The man who came to collect her was not Gideon Holt. He was a ranch hand named Decker, somewhere in his 50s, with a face that had been outside in Montana weather for all of them. He looked at Clara's single bag, then at Clara, then back at the bag, and said nothing at all for a moment that stretched long enough to become its own kind of comment. "That everything?" he finally said. "That's everything," Clara said. He loaded the bag without another word, and they rode out toward the Holt Ranch in a silence that Clara spent trying to prepare herself for something she couldn't fully picture. She had been told, 7 children, a working cattle operation, a house that needed attention. She had not been told much about Gideon himself, beyond the fact that his wife had died 14 months ago of a fever that moved fast and left no time for goodbyes. Clara understood grief well enough. She had her own. What she had not anticipated was the land itself. The way Montana opened up around her in a manner that felt less like scenery and more like an argument, wide and cold and indifferent to whatever small plans anyone brought to it. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at it and thought, all right then. The Holt Ranch came into view when they crested a long rise, and Clara's first impression was not what she had expected. She had imagined something neglected, gone soft with mismanagement and sadness. Instead, the ranch looked tight, as though grief had not made it lazy but had pulled it inward, made it hold its breath. The fences were mended, the animals were where they should be, the yard was swept, but there were no flowers anywhere, not even dead ones. The window boxes were empty, and there was a quality of quiet around the house that felt less like peace and more like practice. Decker stopped the wagon in front of the porch, and the front door opened before Clara had climbed down. Agnes came out first. Clara would learn later that Agnes Greer had been the Holt family's housekeeper for 11 years, had arrived the week after Gideon's first wife, Ellen, fell in love with the ranch, and before she'd even learned the names of all the pots. Agnes had stayed through births and sickness and one hard winter that killed a third of the cattle and left Gideon so quiet he barely spoke for 2 months. She had raised those children as much as anyone, and she believed, with the complete conviction of someone who has earned the right to believe, that she knew exactly what this household needed. It did not need Clara Merritt. Agnes was a tall woman, wide in the shoulders, with iron gray hair pulled back so tight it looked like it would hurt. She came down the porch steps with her arms crossed and looked at Clara the way a customs officer looks at luggage. "You're smaller than I expected," she said. Clara set her bag on the ground. "I tend to take up more space than I look like I do." Agnes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that right?" It wasn't a question, so Clara didn't answer it. The second person to emerge from the house was a girl of about 16, tall for her age, with Gideon Holt's dark hair and a look on her face that Clara would later come to understand was not hostility for hostility's sake, but something harder to deal with. It was the expression of someone who had already learned that hope was a thing that could be taken from you, and who had decided not to hold any more of it. This was Ruth. She stood in the doorway and looked at Clara with those guarded eyes and said, "Papa's in the south field. He said to put you in the front room." "Thank you," Clara said. Ruth stepped back inside without another word. Then the smaller children appeared one by one, the way children do. Not all at once, but in cautious waves, as though testing whether it was safe. A boy of about 12 with a scab on his chin. A girl of 9 with her hair in 2 messy braids. A small boy around 7 who walked with his chin tucked down like he was always expecting to be surprised. And little B, who was 4, who stood in the doorway on one bare foot and stared at Clara with the enormous unguarded attention that only very young children can sustain. Clara looked at all of them and understood something clearly and immediately. She had not come to a house that needed new curtains and better cooking. She had come to a house that was holding itself together by a thread made of routine and stubbornness, and every person in it was waiting, in their own way, for the thread to break. Agnes carried Clara's bag inside, not as a kindness, Clara suspected, but because she wanted to see what was in it. The front room was clean and cold. There was a bed, a washstand, a small window that looked out over the empty kitchen garden. Clara set her coat on the chair and went to that window and looked out at the bare dirt and the dried stalks of whatever had grown there before and thought, that's the first thing. She did not think about whether she was welcome. That question felt too large and too premature. She thought instead about what she could see from where she was standing and what she might do about it. Gideon Holt came in from the south field at 4:30, and Clara was in the kitchen when he arrived, having asked Agnes if she might make herself useful, and been told, with a tightness around the mouth that was almost admirable, the flour is in the left cabinet. She was making biscuits. It was not glamorous. It was not strategic. She simply needed something to do with her hands while she thought, and the children looked hungry in a way that went beyond just the meal they'd missed. Gideon came through the back door and stopped when he saw her. He was taller than she'd imagined, lean, the way men get who work hard and don't think much about eating. His face was weathered in the way that Montana weather produced, not aged exactly, but layered like rock that had been through several winters and didn't pretend otherwise. He had dark eyes and a jaw that was currently holding a considerable amount of tension, and when he saw Clara at his kitchen counter, his first expression was not warmth or welcome. It was something more like resignation. "You're here," he said. "I am," Clara said. She kept her hands in the flour. He took off his hat and held it. "The ride out was all right?" "It was fine." There was a pause in which both of them seemed to recognize that they were two strangers who had agreed, by letter, to share a life, and that the gap between that agreement and this particular moment, flour on her hands, hat in his, children watching from the doorway, was wider than either had quite reckoned with. "I can show you around tomorrow," Gideon said. "The house, The outbuildings. There's a schedule for the well and for the... I can find my way, Clara said, not unkindly. You don't have to take time from your work on my account. He looked at her for a moment. You're not what I expected. Clara pulled the biscuit dough together. Nobody ever is. Agnes watched this entire exchange from the corner of the kitchen with her arms folded and her opinion plainly written on her face, and when Gideon went to wash up, she came to stand beside Clara and said very quietly, "Don't mistake a man being polite for a man being welcoming." "I don't," Clara said. "Good." Agnes picked up a dish towel. "Because there have been 2 women before you who thought they could walk into this house and rearrange it to suit themselves, and they were both gone inside of 3 months. Clara looked at her. "Were they running from the house or from you?" Agnes's chin came up. For a moment, the kitchen held nothing but the 2 of them and the smell of biscuits beginning to bake. "We'll see," Agnes said finally, and walked out. That night, dinner was the quietest Clara had ever experienced in a room with 9 people in it. The biscuits disappeared in 4 minutes. The 7-year-old, Thomas, she'd learned, ate 3 of them and didn't look up from his plate once. Little B kept looking at Clara sideways, then looking away when Clara looked back, then doing it again. Ruth said nothing to anyone. The boy with the scab on his chin, Seth, 12, ate with his elbows on the table and watched Clara the way he might watch an unfamiliar animal, assessing what it ate and whether it bit. Gideon said grace and then passed the bread, and that was the extent of his conversation. Clara ate her dinner and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, the particular creaks of an old structure, the distant sound of cattle, the wind coming down off the mountain. And she thought, this is what I have. This is where I start. After the younger children were put to bed, a process Clara observed but did not insert herself into, understanding that some things couldn't be rushed, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her mother's recipe book and started making a list. Not a list of what was wrong. She already knew what was wrong. She made a list of what she could fix by Thursday. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway sometime after 9 o'clock. She stood there for a moment as though she hadn't quite intended to come as far as the door. "You don't have to wait up," she said. "I'm not waiting," Clara said. "I'm making notes." Ruth looked at the recipe book. "What kind of notes?" "Meal plans, what's in the pantry, what needs to be ordered, what I can make with what's here until the order arrives." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thomas doesn't eat onions. He picks them out and hides them in his napkin, and Pa doesn't notice, but the napkins are disgusting." Clara wrote that down. "Thomas, no onions." "What about the others?" she asked. Ruth's jaw shifted slightly, the movement of someone fighting the instinct toward cooperation. Then she crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe and began to list, one by one, the preferences and aversions and small peculiarities of her 6 siblings in a flat, practiced tone that told Clara she had been keeping track of these things for a very long time. Probably since her mother died. Probably since before that. Clara wrote everything down. She did not say thank you for trusting me, or I know how hard this must be, or any of the things that would have made Ruth put the wall back up immediately. She just wrote. When Ruth ran out of things to say, she stood there another moment, then said, "The biscuits were good." "Your father's yeast is almost gone," Clara said. "I'll need more before Sunday." Ruth nodded once. Then she went back upstairs, and Clara sat for a while longer in the kitchen listening to the house settle, and thought about her mother's kitchen when she was small, and what it felt like to be known in a place. To have someone who made note of what you couldn't eat and what you couldn't say and kept that information the way you keep something valuable. She thought about how long it had been since she'd had that. Then she turned the page and kept writing. 3 days into her time at the Holt Ranch, Clara discovered the state of the pantry. It was not catastrophic. It was worse than that. It was the slow decline of a system that had once been well organized and was now being held together by repetition without thought. The same staples reordered, the same meals rotated, nothing fresh, nothing seasonal, everything adequate and nothing more. The kitchen was clean in the way things are clean when someone works hard at the surfaces and stops looking underneath. Agnes watched Clara go through every shelf and cabinet with the look of someone waiting to be accused. Clara didn't accuse. She said, You've kept this going for 14 months with 7 children and a working ranch. That's not a small thing. Agnes's posture changed. Not softened exactly, but adjusted. There's a method, she said carefully. There is, Clara agreed, and some of it's better than mine. I'd like to know your method for the salt pork because the way I learned takes too long. Agnes blinked. It was a small blink, but Clara caught it. You cook? Agnes said. Since I was 6, my mother didn't have much patience for children who watched from the doorway. This was the first real thing Clara had told anyone about herself, and Agnes received it the way pragmatic people receive information. She filed it and adjusted her position accordingly. They spent the next hour in the kitchen together, and it was not warm and it was not friendly, but it was 2 women looking at the same problem from different angles, and by the end of it, they had a workable system, and Agnes had let Clara touch the good cast iron skillet, which was, Clara understood, a significant concession. The children watched all of this from their safe distances. Seth came closest, not to talk, but to hover, which in a 12-year-old boy means approximately the same thing. He appeared in the kitchen doorway while Clara was mending the torn hem on Bee's dress. Ruth had left it on the kitchen table with a look that said, I noticed this needs doing, and I don't have time. And Seth stood there pretending to look for something on the shelf. The thread's in the top drawer, Clara said without looking up. Blue and brown. There's a needle already threaded in the blue, if that's what you're after. Seth's face went through about 4 expressions in 2 seconds. I wasn't looking for thread. All right, Clara kept sewing, a long pause. Then, how'd you know about the thread? I looked through everything when I arrived. I like to know where things are. Seth considered this. Agnes says that's prying. Agnes is right that it can be, Clara said. The difference is whether you use what you find to help or to judge. Seth chewed on this for a while. Then he pulled something from his pocket, a piece of leather strap with a buckle, broken cleanly, and held it out. Decker says it can't be fixed, he said. I think he's wrong. Claire set down the dress and took the leather strap and examined it. The break was clean, not frayed, which meant it hadn't been weak. It had been stressed beyond its capacity all at once. She turned it over. It can be fixed, she said. You'll need to punch a new hole here, and the buckle needs to be reset, or it'll pull the same way again. You have a punch? Seth's chin came up slightly. In the barn. After supper, then. He tucked the strap back in his pocket and walked away without saying thank you, which Clara found more honest than if he had. Little Bee was the easiest. She was 4, which meant she had not yet learned the architecture of self-protection. By the end of the first week, she had adopted the habit of following Clara around at a distance of approximately 3 feet, not participating in whatever Clara was doing, but observing with the focused intensity of a small scientist cataloging a new specimen. On Thursday of the first week, Bee appeared at Clara's elbow while Clara was at the kitchen counter and held up a rag doll with a missing button eye. She can't see, Bee said. Clara dried her hands. Let's fix that. They sat together at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, and Clara showed Bee how to thread a needle. A piece of information Bee accepted with the gravity of someone receiving state secrets, and sewed the button back on while Bee watched every stitch. When it was done, Bee held the doll up and inspected the repair, and then looked at Clara with an expression of pure, uncomplicated relief. Thank you, Bee said. Clara touched the top of Bee's head, light and brief. She can see again. Bee slid off the chair and carried the doll away, already talking to it under her breath about something that had happened in the yard. Clara watched her go and felt something pull in her chest. Not pain, exactly. Closer to recognition. Gideon noticed what Clara was doing, but he watched from further back than the children did. He was not a man who showed his thinking easily. He did his work, and he came to meals, and he was not unkind, but there was a quality to him that Clara recognized, the particular stillness of someone who had sealed something off. Not locked it, not buried it, but sealed it the way you seal a room you're not ready to go back into. You can see the door. You're just not opening it. He said very little to her in those first days, but on the 6th evening he came into the kitchen after the children were in bed and found Clara repairing the leg of one of the dining chairs, which had been wobbling so severely that Thomas had nearly gone over backward at breakfast. Gideon looked at the chair, then at Clara on the floor, with the leg in her hands and a jar of wood glue beside her. "I was going to fix that," he said. "When?" Clara asked, not accusingly. He rubbed the back of his neck. "When I had time." Clara nodded and kept working. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who understood each other's days well enough not to require explanation. Gideon pulled out a chair and sat down. This surprised her. She'd expected him to go back to wherever he'd come from. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "My father. He believed everyone in the house should be able to do everything the house required. He didn't think there was work that belonged only to men and work that belonged only to women. Smart man." "He was stubborn," Clara said, "which is a different thing that sometimes leads to the same place." Something shifted in Gideon's face, the almost movement of an almost smile. It didn't quite arrive, but it had been close. "Agnes says you've been asking after the kitchen garden," he said. "It's not too late in the season to put a few things in. Root vegetables mostly, hardy greens. It won't be much this year, but it establishes the soil." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Ellen planted that garden." He said it the way you say something when you've decided to say it before you thought about whether you were ready. "She spent 2 weeks clearing it when we first got here, said the ground was wrong, and she was going to fix it." Clara held the chair leg steady, waiting for the glue to take. "She sounds like someone who knew what a garden wanted," she said. Gideon looked at his hands on the table. "She did. A beat. A lot of things around here were hers." Clara understood what he was saying. She understood that the kitchen garden was not just a kitchen garden, and the window boxes were not just window boxes, and the recipe book she'd found tucked at the back of the pantry with EH written inside the front cover was not just a recipe book. She had moved it to a more accessible shelf without mentioning it, because it should be there, and because she had not come to erase anyone. "I won't plant anything she would have planted," Clara said. "If you'd rather I left it." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "She would have been furious at me for letting it go." He stood up, pushing the chair back. "Plant what you need." He went to bed. Clara sat on the kitchen floor and held the repaired chair leg until she was sure the joint had taken, and outside the window the Montana sky was doing what Montana skies do at night, going enormous and cold and full of stars. And she thought about a woman named Ellen, who had spent 2 weeks clearing ground she believed she could fix. There was one moment in the second week that nobody saw, which was the only reason it happened the way it did. Clara was in the front room alone, and she had taken out the letter from the matrimonial bureau, and she was reading it again. Not because she'd forgotten what it said, because she needed to remember why she'd come. She had lost her position as a schoolteacher in Ohio 2 years prior. The school board had decided, after she'd refused to marry the alderman's son, that her contract would not be renewed. She had gone to her cousin's house in Indiana and spent 6 months feeling herself become smaller by degrees, taking up less space, apologizing for her appetite, for her opinions, for the fact that she was still in the spare room. Then her cousin's husband had made it clear, without saying it in any language that could be quoted, that Clara's presence was straining the household, and Clara had sat with that for 3 days and then written to the matrimonial bureau. She was not here because she wanted to be rescued. She was here because she was 34 years old and capable and full of something that had been compressed for too long, and she needed somewhere that had problems she could solve, and she was willing to work for the right to stay somewhere she might eventually belong. She folded the letter back into its quarters and put it in the pocket of her dress, and that was the last time she took it out. Ruth watched all of this from her own distance, and her distance was the longest. She was 16, and she had been running this household in the space between Agnes's authority and her father's grief for 14 months, making decisions nobody asked her to make because somebody had to make them. She had learned which of her siblings cried at night and what helped. She had learned which supplies needed ordering and when. She had learned to watch her father's face for the particular strain that meant he was close to the edge, and how to redirect a mealtime conversation before it got there. She had done all of this without being asked, and without being thanked, and without once saying, "This is too much for a 16-year-old to carry." And now here was Clara, moving through the kitchen with her quiet efficiency, making notes in her book, winning over Bea and Seth and Thomas without appearing to try, and Ruth felt something that she was honest enough with herself to recognize even if she couldn't quite say it. She felt replaced. Not because Clara was replacing her, but because the person who should have been doing all of those things, the adult who should have been holding this household together, was finally here. And that meant the last 14 months of Ruth doing it had been visible evidence of an absence, and looking at Clara meant looking at the shape of what had been missing, and Ruth was not ready to look at that shape yet. So she was cold. Not cruel. Ruth Holt had not inherited the capacity for gratuitous cruelty, whatever else she'd inherited. But cold, formal, careful. Clara didn't push, she noticed. She saw Ruth's hands at the end of the day, the chapping from dishwater, the calluses in places that a girl of 16 shouldn't have calluses yet. She saw the way Ruth carried herself, straight-backed, composed, the posture of someone holding something heavy and refusing to show the weight. Clara had been 34 and doing the same thing, and she knew, with a certainty that came from having done it herself, that you could not take that weight from someone by telling them to put it down. You had to give them somewhere safe to set it. She was patient. The patience cost her something. There were moments when she was tired enough that kindness felt like lifting a stone, when the sheer amount of need in that house pressed against everything she had, when she lay in the cold front room and thought about Ohio, about the classroom she'd lost, about the life she'd been building that had been casually disassembled by men who had more authority than sense. But then she would think about Bea's doll, and the list Ruth had given her about onions and the other small truths of her siblings, and the way Gideon's face had done almost smile, and she would get up in the morning and do it again. The first real test came at the end of the second week. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pruitt, who had been with the Holts for only a few months, said something at the fence line about the mail-order woman that the older hands heard and the children did not, and it was ugly enough that Decker told him to keep his mouth shut, and Pruitt said that he was entitled to his opinion about women who sold themselves to the highest bidder, and Decker said that Pruitt was about to find himself with significantly fewer teeth. The fight didn't happen, but the conversation reached Agnes, who came to find Clara in the kitchen garden where Clara was turning the first row of soil. Agnes stood on the edge of the garden and said, "You know what people are saying in town?" "Probably," Clara said, and kept working. "It doesn't bother you." "Of course it bothers me." Clara drove the spade into the ground. "It bothers me considerably, but I'm not going to stop working because somebody's uncomfortable with why I'm here. I know why I'm here. That's enough." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "The last woman," she said, "cried for 3 days when she heard what people were saying and left before the month was out." Clara looked up. "I'm not her." "No," Agnes said, studying her. "I'm beginning to think you're not." She didn't offer to help with the garden, but she brought out a cup of coffee without being asked and set it on the fence post where Clara could reach it and went back inside. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't acceptance, it was a cup of coffee. Clara drank it and kept digging. By the end of the second week, the kitchen had been reorganized in a way that was more efficient without being unrecognizable. 3 of the dining chairs had been repaired. Bea had learned the names of 12 vegetables and was very proud of this. Seth had his leather strap fixed and had returned twice more with other things that needed attention. Thomas had eaten 2 full meals without hiding anything in his napkin, and the front garden had its first row of winter turnips in the ground. Ruth had said good morning to Clara for the first time. Gideon had asked her at dinner whether she'd grown up on a farm, and she'd said no, in a town, but her mother had kept a garden, and he'd nodded and reached for the salt. And that was the whole conversation, and somehow it was enough. Clara sat in the kitchen on the last night of her second week with her tea and her list, and the house was quiet around her, the deep, settled quiet of a place where everyone is asleep. And she thought about the kitchen garden and what it would look like in spring. She thought about Ruth's hands. She thought about what Gideon had looked like when he said Ellen planted that garden. Not broken, but careful. The way you move through a room where you've rearranged the furniture and you still sometimes forget and reach for where the chair used to be. She was not going to fill that absence. She knew that. She was not Ellen Holt, and she was not going to be, and she had not come here to pretend otherwise. She had come here because she had something to offer, and this place had need of it. And those 2 things, if you were patient enough and honest enough, could become something real. It wouldn't be smooth. Nothing real ever was. Outside, the Montana sky was doing its enormous, cold thing with the stars. And inside the house, one of the smaller children shifted in their sleep and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. And Clara listened to the silence that followed and decided she could work with this. She turned the page and kept writing. The turnips came up crooked. Clara had expected that. The soil in the kitchen garden had been neglected long enough that it had compacted in uneven layers, and no amount of first-season turning was going to fix that entirely. The seedlings pushed through at angles, some of them listing left, a few so tilted they looked like they were trying to get a better view of something. She crouched beside the row on a gray Tuesday morning and looked at them without disappointment. Crooked things still grew. She'd seen enough of that in people to trust it in plants. She was still crouching there when Ruth came out of the house with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and stopped at the edge of the garden. "They're crooked," Ruth said. "They are," Clara agreed. "Does that mean they'll fail?" Clara looked up at her. "It means the ground's not right yet. Doesn't mean the plant won't try." She stood, brushing the dirt from her skirt. "They'll straighten as they go, or they won't. Either way, something comes up." Ruth looked at the row for a moment, and there was something in her expression that was not quite about turnips. Then she pulled her shawl tighter and went back inside without another word, and Clara let her go. That was the third week. The weeks at the Holt Ranch had a particular texture to them, each one slightly different from the last, but accumulating in a way that was slow and not always visible while it was happening. Like the soil itself, something was being built underneath that wouldn't show until later. The household had its rhythms, and Clara had been working her way into them carefully, the way you work a foot into a boot that doesn't quite fit, not forcing it, but persistent, adjusting her weight. Agnes remained the most complex terrain. She was not unfair. Clara had recalibrated her initial read of the woman and understood now that Agnes's guardedness was not pettiness. It was loyalty, which was a different animal entirely. Agnes had held this family together out of genuine attachment, not obligation, and she had done it in the way that people do when they've never been given formal authority, by being indispensable, by making herself necessary. And now here was Clara, with her recipe book and her list-making and her quiet efficiency, and the question underneath everything Agnes said or didn't say was, "What is my place in this house if yours is everything mine used to be?" Clara understood the question because she'd asked her own version of it for years. She had not taken over the household. She had arranged herself around Agnes the way water arranges itself around stone, not moving the stone, but finding the passage. When Agnes cooked, Clara assisted without directing. When Clara handled the mending and the garden and the children's lessons, she left the kitchen domain clearly under Agnes's management. This was not strategic submission. It was recognition that Agnes had earned something in this house that couldn't be revoked without causing damage that would reach all the way to the children, and Clara was not here to cause damage. But the arrangement was imperfect and sometimes tense, and there was one morning in the third week when it nearly came apart. It started with bread. Agnes had a method for the bread that she had used for 11 years and did not deviate from. Clara had watched it twice now and understood why it worked, but she had also noticed that the bread came out dense in the center. Good bread. Nobody was complaining, but heavier than it needed to be because the dough wasn't getting a second rise. She had not said anything about this. She had been waiting. On a Thursday morning, when Agnes had already started the dough and had her back turned, Bee climbed up on the stool beside Clara and said, loudly and with the complete honesty of a 4-year-old, "Clara's bread is fluffier." The kitchen went still. Agnes turned around slowly. Clara picked up her coffee cup and said nothing. There was nothing to be said. The statement had been made by someone too young to understand its diplomatic consequences, and too genuine to have meant anything beyond the literal truth. Agnes looked at Clara. Clara met her eyes and did not look away, and also did not apologize for something she hadn't done, which was the only honest position available to her. "Is it?" Agnes said flatly. "I use a second rise," Clara said. "It takes longer. Your method's faster, which matters on a ranch schedule. Different priority, not a wrong one." Agnes studied her for a moment that was precisely as long as it needed to be. "Show me," she said finally. Clara set down her coffee cup and showed her. They stood side by side at the counter for the next 2 hours, and it was not easy and it was not warm. But at the end of it, there was a loaf that was lighter in the center, and Agnes had learned something she would never admit to having learned, which was fine because Clara was not keeping score. That afternoon, Agnes brought Clara a cup of coffee without being asked, which was the second time. Clara accepted it without comment, which was the correct response. Gideon noticed the bread. He said it at dinner, not effusively, not the kind of compliment that was meant to be noticed. Just, "Bread's different." Agnes said, "I adjusted the method," and that was that. Clara reached for the butter and caught Seth watching her across the table with an expression that was 9 parts observation and 1 part satisfaction, and she gave him a look that said, "Don't," and he went back to his plate with the tiniest possible adjustment to his mouth that might have been a smirk. The children were teaching her things without knowing they were doing it. Not about the ranch, they were learning the ranch from her, the ones young enough to want to know, but about their father, about the shape of the grief in this house. Thomas, who was 7 and the quietest of the lot, had a habit of going to stand at the door of a room on the north side of the house that was kept closed. He didn't try the handle. He just stood there, sometimes with his forehead almost touching the wood. Clara had seen him do it 3 times before she understood. That had been his mother's sewing room. There were probably still things in it that smelled like her, and Thomas was old enough to want that, and too young to understand why he couldn't go in. She thought about saying something to Gideon. She thought about it for 3 days before deciding it wasn't her place yet. Some doors needed to be opened by the right person at the right time, and she didn't know enough yet to know when that time was. Instead, she found Thomas one afternoon sitting on the porch steps with a sock in his hand, a sock with a hole in the heel, held with the defeated expression of someone who has found a problem that cannot be ignored but also doesn't know what to do with it. "Bring it in," Clara said. "I'll show you how to darn it." Thomas looked at the sock. "Boys don't darn." "Boys with holes in their socks do," Clara said, "unless they'd rather have cold heels." He thought about this and followed her inside. She sat him across from her at the kitchen table with his own needle and a darning egg and walked him through it, not doing it for him, but talking him through the pattern, letting him make the mistakes and then correct them. He was focused in the way that serious children are focused, with his whole body bent over the work, his tongue slightly visible at the corner of his mouth. When he finished, the repair was uneven and one corner had more thread than it needed, but it held. Thomas turned the sock over and looked at it. "Mama taught Ruth to sew," he said. It was the first time he'd spoken his mother aloud to Clara, and he said it carefully, like testing a floorboard. "She must have been good at it," Clara said. "Ruth's stitches are even. She made quilts." Thomas set the sock down. "There's one in the room at the end of the hall." Clara kept her expression even. "I know which room you mean." Thomas looked at her, and there was something in those 7-year-old eyes that was older than it should have been. "Do you go in there?" "No," Clara said. "Why not?" "Because that's not my room to go into. It belongs to your family." She met his eyes. "Just because I live here doesn't mean every part of this house is mine. Some things stay where they are." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the sock and turned it over again, examining the repair. "Would you teach me to do the other one?" "Yes," Clara said. "Same time tomorrow." He nodded once and took his sock and went back outside, and Clara sat at the kitchen table and thought about the room at the end of the hall, and about a woman who made quilts and planted kitchen gardens and raised children who stood at closed doors with their foreheads nearly touching the wood. She thought about how you lived in the space left by someone without filling it. The tension with Ruth reached its first real breaking point toward the end of the 3rd week, and it happened over something that seemed small and wasn't. There was a community gathering in Harland Creek. Not a formal occasion, just the kind of irregular social event that frontier towns assembled when they needed a reason to be in the same room, which was often. A church hall, some food, the opportunity for people to see each other and form the opinions that small communities run on. Gideon said at breakfast that he was taking the older children into town for it, and he looked at Clara across the table with a question in his expression that was not quite an invitation and not quite the absence of one. I'll stay and watch the younger ones, Clara said, because she understood that appearing in public as Gideon Holt's new arrangement was a thing that needed to happen at the right moment and not before it, and she was not ready, and neither was anyone else. Ruth had started to say something and stopped, and the stop itself was interesting. Clara noted it and moved on. She spent the afternoon with Bea and Thomas and the youngest boy, Daniel, who was 5 and had not yet said more than 4 words directly to Clara, but who had taken to sitting wherever she was sitting, which she counted as progress. She made soup and let them help, which turned the kitchen into a minor catastrophe, and the soup into something better than she'd planned because Thomas had the instinct of someone who understood salt. When Gideon and the older children came back from town, Ruth's mood had shifted. She came through the door and went straight upstairs without eating, which was noticeable enough that Seth raised his eyebrows at Clara across the dinner table. Clara waited. Later, after the younger children were in bed, she found Ruth at the kitchen table, not eating, not doing anything, just sitting with her hands flat on the tabletop. Clara put the kettle on without asking and sat down across from her. "Someone said something," she said. It wasn't a question. Ruth's jaw tightened. Mrs. Aldrich told her daughter, loud enough to carry, that it was a shame Gideon Holt had resorted to mail-order solutions when there were decent women right here in town who would have been glad to have him. Clara wrapped her hands around her own cup. "And what did you say?" "Nothing." Ruth looked at her hands. "I didn't know what to say." "That's all right." "It's not." Ruth's voice was flat, but there was something underneath it. "She was talking about you, and I didn't say anything to her, and I don't know what I should have said, but I should have said something." Clara looked at her for a moment. Ruth Holt had just admitted, without quite admitting it, that she felt something like protectiveness toward Clara. This was significant. It was also clearly uncomfortable for Ruth, who had not planned on feeling it. "You don't have to defend me," Clara said carefully. "I can do that myself when the moment needs it. What I'm more interested in is why it bothered you." Ruth looked up. "Because she's wrong." "About what, exactly?" A pause. Ruth's fingers pressed flat against the table. "About you being a solution. She stopped, started again. "You fix things. I've seen you. You fix Seth's strap and Thomas's sock and Bee's doll, and you fix the chairs, and you fix the bread, and you talked to Daniel in a way he actually responded to, and you didn't." Her voice shifted slightly. "You didn't make any of us feel like we were part of the problem you were solving." Clara was quiet. "I didn't want you here," Ruth said. "I want you to know that. I was very clear in my mind about not wanting you here." "I know," Clara said, "because I thought—" Ruth paused. "I thought if I let someone else care for them, it would mean that my caring wasn't enough. That what I'd been doing for 14 months wasn't—" She stopped. "It was enough," Clara said. "It was more than enough. It was too much. You were 16 and you were carrying something that should have been shared, and you carried it alone because there was nobody else." She held Ruth's gaze. "Nothing I do now says anything different about what you did then." Ruth looked at her. There were no tears. Ruth Holt did not cry easily, and Clara had already understood this about her. But there was something around her eyes that was the shape of tears without being them. "I still don't entirely trust you," Ruth said. "That's reasonable," Clara said. "I haven't been here long enough to earn it. But I don't dislike you." "I'll take that," Clara said. Ruth exhaled, a long, slow exhale, the kind that releases something that's been held a while. Then she wrapped her hands around the cup Clara had set in front of her and drank. They sat in the kitchen in a silence that was different from the one before. Not warm yet, but no longer cold. Something in between. The beginning of something. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain the way it always did at night, and the house made its particular settling sounds, and Clara thought about what Ruth had said. "You didn't make us feel like we were part of the problem you were solving." And she was glad she had done that right, even if she hadn't done everything right, and she knew it. She had been short with Bea one morning when she was tired, a sharpness in her voice that wasn't warranted, and Bea had gone very still, and Clara had apologized immediately and meant it, and the afternoon had recovered, but she'd felt the mistake in her chest the way you feel it when you've let something slip that you promised yourself you'd hold. She was imperfect in this place. She moved too fast sometimes, asked too many questions, reorganized things before she'd earned the right to reorganize them, misjudged the timing of a kindness, and offered it when it was read as interference. She made mistakes, and she fixed them, and she made different mistakes the next time. That was the actual texture of it. The situation with Pruitt came to a head in the 4th week. He was a problem that had been sitting on the edge of the ranch's daily life, like a stone in a boot. Not catastrophic, but impossible to ignore. He'd made one more comment within earshot of the house. Something to another hand about whether Gideon had paid good money for his new housekeeper, and Decker had finally gone to Gideon and said that Pruitt needed to go before somebody's patience ran out, and something happened that couldn't be undone. Gideon let Pruitt go on a Wednesday morning, and the other hands watched him ride out, and the matter was considered closed. But not entirely, because Pruitt had a wide mouth and a grudge, and by Thursday there was a version of the story circulating in Harlan Creek in which Gideon Holt's new woman had manipulated him into firing a perfectly capable hand, and by Friday that story had reached Agnes, who came to find Clara in the garden with the expression of someone carrying information they're not sure they want to deliver. Agnes told her the version of the story that was circulating, and then stood and waited for Clara's reaction. Clara was quiet for a long moment. She dug her spade into the soil and turned it. "Is that what you believe?" she asked. "No," Agnes said. "I believe Pruitt was an idiot who couldn't keep his mouth shut, and Gideon made the right call." She paused. "But people in town will talk." "They were already talking," Clara said. "The version of me that exists in Harlan Creek is not something I can control. People have already decided what I am." She looked up. "What I can control is what happens inside this fence, which is enough for now." Agnes tilted her head slightly. "You're a particular kind of stubborn," she said. "My father's daughter," Clara said. Agnes almost smiled. It didn't quite land, but the shape of it was there, and Clara saw it, and neither of them acknowledged it, which was the right way to handle it. She went into town for the first time at the end of the 4th week. She went with Agnes, which was Agnes's idea, a development that surprised Clara sufficiently that she'd had to keep her face very controlled when Agnes announced it at breakfast. The town of Harlan Creek was what towns like it always were, practical and wind-worn, with false fronts on the buildings that promised more structure than existed behind them, a general store that smelled of coffee and leather and cold metal, a post office, a livery, and a population that had already sorted itself into those who would be civil to Clara Merritt and those who wouldn't. Mrs. Aldrich was in the general store. She was a formidable woman of about 50, with the posture of someone who considered herself an authority on social order, and she looked at Clara the way you look at something that has arrived in the wrong category. Agnes walked in ahead of Clara and stopped in front of the counter and said, without preamble, "This is Clara Merritt. She's been managing the Holt household for a month now, and those children look better than they have since Ellen died. I thought you should know that, Harriet, since I know you've been having your opinions." The store went very quiet. Mrs. Aldrich's expression shifted through several stages. "Agnes, I know what you said at the gathering," Agnes said, with the particular authority of someone who has been in this town 11 years and is not afraid of social consequences. "And I know what Pruitt's been saying since Gideon let him go. And I'm telling you, as someone who was against this arrangement from the beginning and changed her mind, that Clara Merritt is exactly what that house needed, and I'd appreciate it if you'd stop telling people otherwise." She turned back to the counter and asked the storekeeper for what she needed, and the conversation was over. Clara stood in the middle of the general store and thought, "She didn't tell me she was going to do that." Agnes looked at her sideways on the way back to the wagon. "Don't read too much into it," she said. "I won't," Clara said. "I said what I said because it's true. Not because we're—" Agnes made a gesture that encompassed all the things they weren't. "I know," Clara said. They rode back to the ranch in a silence that was different from the ride out. It had more in it, and not in a bad way. Gideon heard what Agnes had done in town because in a place like Harlan Creek, everyone heard everything inside of about 48 hours. He came to find Clara in the kitchen garden that evening, and he stood on the other side of the fence looking at her in a way that she couldn't quite read. "Agnes went to bat for you," he said. Agnes went to bat for what she thought was right, Clara said. Those aren't always the same thing, but in this case they were. Gideon put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at the kitchen garden, at the crooked turnip rows that had straightened somewhat since the first week. And then he looked at Clara. This is harder than I thought it would be, he said. Not about the ranch. Not about the work. Clara looked back at him. For me, too, she said, because it was true, and because she thought he was a man who could handle the truth better than he could handle being managed. He looked at her for a moment, and something moved through his expression. Not the almost smile this time, but something that was heavier and more considered and more honest. You're staying, then, he said. Clara turned back to the garden. I'm staying. He nodded once and walked back toward the barn, and she watched him go, and thought about what it meant that he'd needed to hear it said plainly, and what it meant that she'd been able to say it plainly, and about the gap between those two things gradually, imperfectly, in 1,000 small ways, beginning to close. The month turned and October came in hard, the way October comes to Montana, all at once, without apology. The warmth left overnight and didn't return, and the mornings were the kind of cold that sat in the bones and required strategy to manage. Clara added a second wool layer to each child's morning routine, found a pair of Seth's old boots in the back of the mudroom that Daniel had grown into, repaired the split in the blanket on Thomas's bed that had been letting cold through one corner. She was bone-tired in a way she hadn't been in a long time. Not unwell, just used. The way tools get used when they're doing what they're meant for. She felt the tiredness and worked through it, which was the only option available to her, and at the end of the day she sat with her tea and her list and added to what needed doing and crossed off what had been done. Ruth started coming to the kitchen after the younger ones were in bed. Not every night. Some nights. She would sit with her own cup of something and sometimes talk and sometimes not, and Clara let her choose without pressure. Some nights Ruth talked about her mother in the careful way that someone talks about a person they're still figuring out how to miss. Some nights she talked about nothing more significant than what the horses were doing or whether the winter was going to be bad. Clara listened. That was what was needed. She was not Ruth's mother and was not trying to be, but she was a woman in this house who had the time and the interest to sit and listen, and Ruth was a girl who had been doing most of the talking in her family by necessity and very little of the being heard, and those two things fit together. One night Ruth said, "Do you think he's glad you came?" Clara considered the question. "I think he's relieved that the house is being managed. Whether he's glad—" She paused. "He's still working out what he thinks." "He looks at you sometimes," Ruth said, as though this were a report she was delivering without editorial. "I know," Clara said. "Does that bother you?" Clara thought about Gideon, about the way he came through the back door at 4:30 and checked the kitchen before he did anything else, whether he knew it or not. About the way he'd sat down at the kitchen table that first week when she'd expected him to leave. About the firmness of, "I was going to fix that," and the honesty underneath it. "No," she said, "it doesn't bother me." Ruth nodded, and they sat quietly for a while, and outside the Montana night pressed against the windows, and the house held them all in the way that houses do when they've been kept by someone who means to keep them. It was in this particular week, with the cold fully settled in and the household finding its footing, that Clara first noticed something was wrong with Will. Will Holt was 10 years old, the fourth child, the one she'd had the least traction with. He was not hostile, not warm, just present in the way that middle children sometimes are, absorbed into the general life of the family without sharp edges in either direction. He was a sturdy boy, outdoor-oriented, the one most likely to be found in the barn with the animals rather than in the house. She noticed it first in the way he ate, or didn't eat, at 2 consecutive dinners. Just a picking at things, a pushing around, the fork moving but nothing really disappearing. She watched it and said nothing. Then she noticed, the morning after the second dinner, that he came down the stairs too slowly. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. Just a slight heaviness, a slight vacancy in his eyes, a quality of effort in the ordinary that shouldn't have been there. She put her hand to his forehead without warning when he came into the kitchen. He started. "Hey." "Sorry," she said. "You're warm." Will straightened his back. "I'm fine." "You're warm," she said again. He met her eyes with the particular look of a boy who has decided he's not going to be unwell, as though illness were a choice he could refuse. "It's cold outside. I was in the barn." "Go sit by the stove," Clara said. "I'll get you something warm to drink." "I don't need— Will." She said his name steadily, without alarm, without drama. "Go sit by the stove." He went. She watched him go, and the slight drag in his step told her what she needed to know. And she stood in the kitchen for a moment thinking about what she'd brought with her in that carpet bag, her mother's recipe book, which had a section at the back that wasn't recipes at all, but a different kind of knowledge entirely. And she thought about what she'd need and whether she had it, and whether what she was feeling was concern or something closer to the beginning of fear. She made him the drink and watched him hold the cup and watched the way his eyes were slightly unfocused. And she went to find Agnes. Agnes was in the mudroom sorting through a basket of mending when Clara found her, and she took one look at Clara's face and put the basket down. "Will," Clara said, "he's running a fever." Agnes's expression shifted. Not panic, but the particular tightening of someone who has been through this before and knows exactly what the word fever means in a household that lost a woman to one 14 months ago. She moved past Clara without a word and went to the kitchen where Will was sitting by the stove, and she put her own hand to his forehead, his cheek, the back of his neck, moving through the assessment with the efficiency of long practice. Will submitted to this with the resigned expression of a boy who had already lost the argument. "How long?" Agnes asked Clara. "I noticed it at dinner 2 nights ago," Clara said. "I thought it was just tired. This morning it's different." Agnes pulled her hand back. "It's not high yet." "No," Clara agreed. "But the direction it's going concerns me." They looked at each other over Will's head, and in that look was a conversation that neither of them said aloud, because Will was 10 years old and sitting right there, and there was no reason to put the shape of their worry into the room with him. "Go back upstairs," Agnes told him. "I'll bring breakfast up." Will opened his mouth. "Don't," Agnes said. He went. Clara was already moving toward the pantry, pulling down jars, reading labels, checking what she had and what she didn't. Her mother's recipe book was on the counter where she kept it, and she opened to the back section. Not the recipes, but the pages her mother had covered in a smaller, more careful hand. Remedies, treatments, the accumulated knowledge of a woman who'd raised 4 children in a town that was 3 hours from the nearest doctor and had learned that there were things you could do and things you couldn't, and the critical skill was knowing which was which. "What are you looking for?" Agnes asked from the doorway. "Willow bark. Do we have any?" Agnes crossed to a cabinet Clara hadn't fully explored yet and opened the door. Inside were things that weren't food: dried herbs, small cloth bags tied with string, a row of brown glass bottles. Agnes knew exactly where everything was. She pulled down a bag without needing to read the label. "Ellen kept this cabinet," Agnes said. She set the bag on the counter and didn't say anything else, but the fact that she'd opened it, that she'd gone to Ellen Holt's cabinet and taken something out of it and set it beside Clara's mother's book, was a thing Clara understood without requiring explanation. "Thank you," Clara said, and meant it for more than the willow bark. She made the tea with careful proportions, the way her mother had taught her. Not too strong, or it would sit badly on an empty stomach. Not too weak, or it wouldn't do what it needed to do. She added a small amount of something else from her own supplies, a combination her mother had used for the kind of fever that came with a particular quality of listlessness, and she carried the cup upstairs. Will's room was small and shared with Thomas, but Thomas had already been redirected to spend the morning with Decker in the barn. Agnes's doing, efficient and quiet. Will was in bed with his coat still half on, which told Clara he'd been cold on the way upstairs, and cold was not what you wanted on top of a rising fever. She got the coat off him, which required negotiation, and got him under the blankets, which required slightly less, and she sat on the edge of the bed and held out the cup. "It smells bad," Will said. "It does," Clara agreed. "What is it?" "Something my mother taught me, for fevers." He looked at the cup. "Did it work?" "Usually," Clara said. "Not always, but usually." He took the cup with both hands and drank it with the concentrated grimace of a boy determined not to show how bad it tasted. And when he handed the cup back, he lay down and pulled the blanket up and looked at the ceiling. I'm going to be fine, he said. The way he said it told her he'd been thinking about it on the way upstairs and had decided on this position. Probably, Clara said. He looked at her sideways. You're supposed to say yes. I know, she said, but I think you'd rather have the truth. Will considered this. He had dark eyes like his father and something of the same quality of looking, considering before committing, holding his assessment until he had enough to go on. Ruth says you say what you mean. Ruth's observant. She said it like it was a good thing. I hope it is, Clara said. She pulled the blanket straighter at the corners and told him she'd be back in an hour and went downstairs, and the thing she felt going down those stairs was not quite fear and not quite calm, but something balanced uneasily between them, requiring effort to maintain. She told Gideon at lunch. She'd thought about waiting. She'd stood in the kitchen for 5 minutes thinking about whether to tell him at lunch or to wait until evening when she had more information. And she decided that waiting was the thing you did when you were managing someone, and she wasn't going to manage Gideon Holt. She told him while he was washing his hands at the basin before the children came in from wherever they were. Will has a fever, she said. It's moderate right now. I've given him something for it. I'm going to check him again in an hour. I want you to know because it's your son, and you should know. Gideon went still at the basin. The stillness lasted just long enough to tell her everything about what the word fever did to him now. How moderate, he said. Enough to make me pay attention, not enough to panic. She kept her voice steady. He ate a little this morning. He's resting. I've dealt with fevers like this before. Gideon turned around, and on his face was the expression she hadn't seen before, the seal on the room he'd closed, and the seal was under pressure. He was holding himself very composed, but the effort was visible in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands went to his sides. Ellen's fever started moderate, he said. I know, Clara said, and I'm watching him, Gideon. I will tell you immediately if anything changes. I am not going to let something get past me, because I was trying not to worry you. He looked at her. Something in the directness of what she'd said seemed to reach him. The specific quality of it, the fact that she'd used his name and hadn't softened the edges, and hadn't made him a promise she couldn't keep. All right, he said after a moment. All right. He went up to see Will before he went back out, and Clara heard them through the ceiling, the low register of Gideon's voice and Will's slightly higher one. Nothing she could make out, just the back and forth of it, the shape of a father and son talking. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of it and went back to work. By afternoon, the fever had climbed. Not dramatically. This was not the kind of illness that announced itself all at once. It moved by degrees, methodically, the way a slow tide moves, and Clara sat beside Will's bed and took his temperature by feel every half hour and watched the quality of his sleep shift from restless to something that concerned her more. He woke once and asked for water, and once and asked where Thomas was, and then went back under, and the color in his face was wrong in the specific way that fevers make a face wrong, too much of it in the wrong places. She went to the back section of her mother's book and read through it twice. Then she went to Agnes. The yarrow, she said, and I need to know if there's anything else in that cabinet. Agnes went through Ellen Holt's cabinet systematically, naming each thing and what it was for. Clara listened and asked questions, and Agnes answered them, and this was not a warm exchange, but it was a precise one, and precision was what the situation required. They assembled what was needed on the kitchen counter, and Clara worked through the preparation while Agnes managed the rest of the household, the dinner that needed making, the younger children who needed to not know yet that something was wrong, the question of whether to send for the doctor in Billings. How far is Billings? Clara asked. 4 hours in good conditions. The road's bad right now. Could be 6. Agnes hesitated. There's a man in town who does what passes for doctoring. He's adequate. What has he done with fevers like this before? A pause that was longer than it needed to be. Told families to wait and see. Clara looked at her. Send for the Billings doctor, she said. Send Decker. Tell him to ride hard. Agnes went to find Decker, and Clara went back upstairs. The afternoon moved into evening with a quality that Clara could only describe as weight. The house got heavier around her as the light changed, as the younger children were fed and the situation explained to them in versions calibrated for each age. Ruth knowing everything, Seth knowing most of it, Thomas knowing that Will wasn't feeling well and needed rest, Bea knowing that her brother had a cold and Clara was taking care of him. Each conversation required different words and different degrees of honesty, and Clara had them all while also moving upstairs and downstairs in the intervals, monitoring, adjusting, replacing the compress when it warmed, getting more tea into Will when he was lucid enough to swallow it. Ruth came to the doorway of Will's room at some point during the early evening and stood there, and Clara looked at her and saw that Ruth was doing what Ruth did, holding it together visibly, which meant she was not holding it together underneath. "He's going to be all right," Ruth said. Not as a statement. As a question she was phrasing as a statement because she couldn't quite say it the other way. "I'm working on it," Clara said, which was honest and not cruel, and was what Ruth actually needed to hear. Ruth nodded once and went back downstairs, and Clara heard her with the younger children. That particular quality of Ruth's voice, the one that came from 14 months of being the one who held it together, steady and calm even when it cost her something. Gideon came in from the last of the evening chores at dark and went straight upstairs. He stood in the doorway of Will's room and looked at his son, and the expression on his face was the one he'd been keeping out of the kitchen all day, and couldn't keep out of his face here, in this room, where the specific nightmare that had taken his wife was playing itself back at a lower volume, and he couldn't stop hearing it. Clara was sitting in the chair beside the bed, and she looked at Gideon and said quietly, "Come in or go back downstairs. Don't stand in the doorway." He came in. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on Will's arm, and Will stirred and opened his eyes. "Hey, Pa," Will said, with the slightly unfocused warmth of a sick person seeing someone they love. "Hey," Gideon said, and his voice was something Clara had not heard from him before, stripped of its usual careful composure, just the one word in the voice of a man who is frightened. "I'm okay," Will said. "Clara says it's a fever." "I know," Gideon said. "She made me drink something that tasted like the barn floor." "Did it help?" Will blinked slowly. "I think so, I'm not sure. She won't say for certain, which means she's being honest." Gideon glanced at Clara, and on his face was an expression she couldn't fully read. Complicated, layered, the expression of a man registering something and not yet sure what to do with it. "Get some rest," Gideon told Will, and Will was already half asleep before the sentence finished. Gideon stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dark yard. Clara stayed in her chair. The room was quiet except for Will's breathing, which was audible enough to monitor without being alarming. After a long while, Gideon said, without turning around, "Ellen's was fast. 2 days from healthy to—" He stopped. "I didn't sleep that second night. I sat with her, and I didn't sleep, and it didn't matter." Clara didn't say this is different or Will is going to be fine, because she didn't know that yet, and saying it would have been a comfort that cost him the truth. "You're not sitting alone this time," she said instead. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the other chair, Thomas's reading chair, small and slightly inadequate for a grown man, to the other side of Will's bed and sat down, and Clara understood that he was staying, and she nodded once, and they both turned their attention back to Will. They sat on opposite sides of that bed for what felt like most of the night, and the conversation they had was not about much, about the ranch, about the road to Billings, about the particular stubbornness of Montana weather. And it was halting and imperfect, and neither of them was saying the things they were actually thinking, but the presence was real, and the watching was shared, and that mattered in ways that words would have been too direct to carry. Around midnight, Will's fever spiked. It happened in the space of half an hour, and Clara felt it before the thermometer confirmed it. A specific quality of heat under her hand when she checked him, and the sound of his breathing changing. She was already moving, already at the door. "Get me the cold water basin," she said to Gideon. "Fresh water as cold as you can get it, and bring up the second set of cloths from the kitchen." Gideon was out of the room before she finished the sentence. Clara worked. That was the only way to say it. She worked, with everything she'd learned from her mother's book, and everything her mother had taught her in person, and everything she'd gathered over 34 years of paying attention. and she worked without panic and without false certainty, and with the specific focused efficiency of someone who understands that this moment requires everything and anything less won't do. She changed the compress every few minutes when it warmed. She got Will sitting up enough to take more of the tea, a different preparation now, stronger, and she talked to him while he drank it. Not about the illness, not about how he felt, but about the barn, about the horses, about the fact that Seth had told her there was a mare that was going to foal before winter. She talked steadily in a low voice, and he half listened and half drifted, and she kept talking. Gideon stood at the foot of the bed and did not get in her way, which she would later think was one of the more remarkable things about him. That in that room, in that crisis, his fear did not make him large and obstructive. He stood where he could see his son, and he stayed out of her radius, and he answered when she needed something and was quiet when she didn't. Agnes appeared at the door sometime after 1 a.m. with more hot water and a look on her face that was stripped of everything but the essential, and she and Clara exchanged 3 sentences, and Agnes went back downstairs to prepare something else. And the chain of it, the two of them, working in their wordless coordination, held. The fever peaked somewhere around 2 a.m. Clara knew it had peaked because Will stopped being restless. There's a specific quality to a fever that has reached its apex, a stillness that is not the stillness of getting better, but the stillness of something that has come to its limit and is now deciding which direction to go. She had seen it before. She sat with her hand on Will's forehead and felt that stillness and thought, now we wait. Gideon had moved back to his chair, but he wasn't sleeping. He was watching Will with the expression of a man who had decided to be present for whatever came next, good or bad, and wasn't going to look away. How long? He asked. An hour, Clara said. Maybe less. If it breaks before dawn, we're through the worst of it. Gideon looked at her. In the low lamplight, his face was all the things it usually controlled better. The fear, the exhaustion, the grief that was never fully separate from the fear. And if it doesn't break, he said. Clara met his eyes. Then we keep working, and we wait for the Billings doctor. And we don't stop. He held her gaze for a long moment. You're not going to sleep, are you? No, she said. He nodded once. Neither am I. They went back to watching. The hour between 2 and 3 in the morning was the longest Clara had spent in a long time. Not because she was afraid, she was, but fear was a manageable thing when you had something to do. It was long because there was nothing to do in that hour except watch and wait, and change the compress and talk to Will in her low, steady voice. And the watching and the waiting required a particular quality of endurance that was different from the active work and more costly. She thought about her mother. She thought about the kitchen in the house where she grew up, and the way her mother had stood over her siblings' beds in the small hours, steady and certain, and how Clara had not understood until now what that certainty had cost. She thought about Will saying, I think she's being honest with his eyes half closed, and the way Gideon had looked at her when he said it. And she thought about 14 months of this man carrying the specific terror that was currently in this room, carrying it every day, and going out and doing the work anyway. She thought, I am not going to let this boy go. It was not a heroic thought. It was simply what was true. The fever broke at 20 minutes past 3. It broke the way fevers break when they're ready. Not dramatically, but definitely. A slow release of heat under her hand. The particular shift in Will's breathing from labored to something smoother. The color in his face beginning to change. Clara kept her hand on his forehead and felt the change, and said nothing for another few minutes, making sure of it. Then she looked at Gideon. He'd seen it too. He was watching his son's face, and he'd seen the change, and on his face was something that was not relief exactly. Relief was too simple a word for what crossed Gideon Holt's face in that moment. It was more like a door opening in a room that had been sealed. The breath he let out was the kind that has been held so long the body forgot it was holding it. It's breaking, Clara said quietly. Gideon put his hand over his face for a moment. 1 moment, no more than that. Then he put his hand down and he looked at his son and he said to Will, who was sleeping and couldn't hear him, Okay. Clara gave them the room, She went downstairs and found Agnes sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and every evidence of having been there for several hours. Agnes looked up when Clara came in, and Clara said, "The fever's breaking." And Agnes closed her eyes briefly, and then opened them and got up and put the kettle on. They sat together at the kitchen table in the dark and cold kitchen, waiting for the kettle, and neither of them spoke for a while. Agnes poured the coffee when it was ready, and pushed a cup across to Clara and took her own, and they drank. "You didn't sleep either," Clara said. "No," Agnes said. "Were you worried?" Agnes wrapped both hands around her cup. "He's Ellen's boy. He has her coloring, her stubbornness." She looked at the table. "When Gideon came to tell me about the fever yesterday, he looked the same way he looked 14 months ago, like he was bracing for something he couldn't stop." Clara was quiet. "You stopped it," Agnes said. It was not a compliment, not exactly. It was a statement of what had happened and what it meant, and coming from Agnes, it had a particular weight. "My mother's knowledge stopped it," Clara said. "I just used it correctly." Agnes looked at her. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't push it off onto someone else. You were up there all night. That was you." Clara didn't argue. They sat in the kitchen until the sky started to lighten, and then the household started waking up the way households do. The sounds of small feet, the creak of the upstairs corridor, and Agnes got up and began breakfast, and Clara went back upstairs. Gideon was still in the chair beside Will's bed. Will was sleeping properly now, the deep, recovering sleep of a fever broken, his face slack and peaceful. Gideon was awake, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and he looked up when Clara came in. "Still breaking," she said. "His temperature's down. He'll sleep most of today, and tomorrow he'll want to eat everything in the kitchen." Gideon let out a breath that was nearly a laugh, though it didn't quite get there. "You should sleep," Clara said. "A few hours. I'll stay with him." "Clara," Gideon stopped. He looked at his son and then at her, and the expression on his face was the open door expression again, the one she'd seen when the fever broke. "I don't know how to—" He stopped again, pressed his hands together. "I didn't see what you were doing when you came here. I thought I did, but I didn't. I was looking for someone to manage a household, and I thought that's what this was." Clara looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "It's not," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He stood up, and for a moment he was very close to her in that small room, and neither of them moved for a second. Then he said, "I'll be back in a few hours," and he went. Clara sat down in the chair he'd been sitting in, still warm from him, and listened to Will breathe, and outside the window the Montana sky was doing what it did at dawn, going pale at the edges, the darkness thinning out, the world coming back into resolution after the long dark. She put her hand on Will's arm, lightly, not waking him. "There you are," she said quietly, to herself as much as to him. When Ruth came upstairs mid-morning and saw Will sitting up in bed eating a small bowl of oatmeal with the focused intensity of someone who had recently remembered that food existed, she stopped in the doorway with her hand pressed flat against the doorframe. Her face did something complicated and fast that she got under control quickly, but not quickly enough that Clara didn't see it. Will looked up. "I'm fine," he said, with oatmeal in the corner of his mouth. Ruth made a sound that was approximately the sound of someone trying to be casual about something that is not casual at all. And then she came into the room and sat on the edge of his bed and said, "You have oatmeal on your face." "I know," Will said. "I don't care." Ruth looked at Clara, and the look was not the closed-off, careful look she'd been managing since Clara's first day. It was something else, something that had more of her in it. "Thank you," she said, direct and uncomfortable and clearly costing her something, which made it the most genuine thing anyone had said to Clara since she arrived. "He did most of the work," Clara said. "Fevers like that. The body does the fighting. All I could do was make it easier." "You know that's not what I mean," Ruth said. Clara held her gaze. "I know," she said. Bea appeared in the doorway behind Ruth and looked at Will, and then at Clara and said, "Is Will fixed?" "He's fixed," Clara said. Bea considered this. "Like the doll?" "Like the doll," Clara said, she said. Bea nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Will looked at Clara with his oatmeal spoon suspended halfway to his mouth and said, "What doll?" "Never mind," Clara said. "Eat your oatmeal." By afternoon, the word had spread to the ranch hands, the way things spread on a ranch, through a kind of atmospheric transmission that didn't require anyone to formally announce anything. And Decker came to the kitchen door and asked after Will and Clara told him, and he nodded and said, in the particular understated way of men who mean more than they say, "Good thing you were here." Clara said, "Yes," and meant it simply. The Billings doctor arrived in the early evening, delayed by the road, and Clara let him examine Will, and he confirmed what she already knew, and he looked at what she'd prepared and used and said, with the professional neutrality of someone assessing a colleague's work, "Solid choices. Whoever managed this knew what they were doing." Agnes, standing in the doorway, said, "She did," and left it at that. Gideon stood in the kitchen later that evening, after the doctor had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and Clara was at the counter writing up what she'd done, and what the timing had been, and what had worked, and what she'd do differently, because this was what you did when you were responsible for people's health. You kept notes, you learned, you didn't let the relief of a good outcome erase the information the experience had given you. Gideon watched her do this from across the kitchen, and the look on his face was the one that had been building for a month, the one that had been behind every almost smile and every paused sentence and every moment when he sat down at the kitchen table when he could have left. He didn't say anything yet, but the look was there, and Clara saw it, and she let it be there without either of them needing to speak it into something it wasn't ready to be yet. She turned back to her notes. The house held them both in the quiet, and outside the Montana night pressed cold against the windows. And somewhere upstairs Will Holt breathed steady and even in his sleep, and the morning felt possible in a way that it hadn't the night before. Will ate 4 biscuits at breakfast 3 days after the fever broke, and nobody said anything about it, which was its own kind of celebration. He sat at the table with the particular appetite of someone whose body had spent several days fighting hard and was now demanding repayment with interest. And he ate steadily and without apology. And Thomas watched him from across the table with an expression that was equal parts relief and competitive assessment of whether Will was going to leave any for the rest of them. Clara watched from the stove and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for the better part of a week. The household had been running on a particular kind of held breath since the fever, and now it was letting go by degrees. Not all at once. Nothing in this house happened all at once. But in the small ways that tension releases when the thing that caused it has passed. Bea laughed at something Daniel did with his spoon, and the laugh was louder than usual, as though she'd been keeping the volume down without knowing it. Seth came through the back door that morning whistling something tuneless and interrupted himself to ask Will if he wanted to come to the barn later, which was Seth's particular version of "I'm glad you're not dead." Will said yes before Seth finished asking. Gideon sat at the head of the table and ate his breakfast and said less than usual, which was already not much, but the quality of his silence was different. It was not the sealed door silence Clara had learned to read in those first weeks. It was something more open than that, a silence that had things moving in it, that was working through something rather than avoiding it. He caught her eye once across the table, in the middle of passing the butter. It was a brief thing, but it was direct in a way that his glances had not been before, and Clara felt it and looked away first, which was unusual for her. She went back to the stove and thought, something changed in that room at 3 a.m, and we have not yet figured out what to do with it. Ruth came to find her after breakfast, when the younger children had scattered and Agnes was starting on the bread, and Gideon had gone out to the south field. Ruth stood in the kitchen doorway in the way she had at the beginning, with her arms folded and her weight shifted slightly back, the posture that said she was here but was preserving the option to not be. And then she seemed to make a decision and came fully into the room. "I want to learn," she said, "what you know about fevers, what's in that cabinet upstairs and what it does, what your mother's book says." Clara turned from the counter. "Why?" Ruth's chin lifted slightly. "Because I've been in this house for 2 years running things, and I didn't know what to do when my brother got sick. I stood in that doorway, and I didn't know what to do." She said it plainly, without drama, the way Ruth said most things that cost her. "I don't want to not know again." Clara looked at her for a moment. This was Ruth Holt asking for something, which required a specific quality of response. Not too much warmth, which would embarrass her. Not too little, which would be wrong. "After dinner," Clara said, "you and I will go through the cabinet and the book. I'll show you what I know. You'll ask what you need to ask." "Fair?" Ruth uncrossed her arms. "Fair," she said, and left. Agnes, at the bread counter, said nothing, but the set of her shoulders had a quality of approval that she hadn't offered with words. The cabinet became a lesson, and the lesson became something else. They sat at the kitchen table that evening, the two of them, with Ellen Holt's cabinet open and the contents arranged between them and Clara's mother's book propped against the flour canister. Clara went through each item methodically. What it was, where it came from, what it did, how much was too much, and what happened if you used too much. Ruth asked precise, practical questions, the kind that told you she was listening not to learn but to retain, storing each answer in the organized mental filing system that had kept this household running for 14 months. She was quick. Clara had already known this, but it was more apparent here, in this specific context, where Ruth's intelligence had a task proportional to it. She made connections faster than Clara expected, between properties of different plants, between symptoms and responses, and asked questions that showed she was already thinking several steps ahead. "You're good at this," Clara said, not as a compliment, but as a factual observation. Ruth looked up from the yarrow she'd been examining. "My mother used to say I'd have made a good doctor if I'd been born different." "Born different how?" "A boy. In a city. With different money." Ruth set down the yarrow. She wasn't wrong. Clara looked at her. She also wasn't right about the born different part. Ruth's eyes came up. "Eyes? People don't let women." "Some people don't," Clara said. "That's true, and it matters, and it's not fair." She kept her voice even. "But your mother was talking about the world as it is. I'm talking about what you do with what you have inside this world, which is not the same conversation." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you did?" "I taught school for 6 years," Clara said, "in a town where they paid me half what they paid the men and expected twice as much work and told me I should be grateful for the opportunity." She straightened a jar that didn't need straightening. "I was good at it. I kept being good at it. And when they took it from me for reasons that had nothing to do with my teaching, I found another way to use what I know." Ruth looked at her with the particular attention she brought to things that mattered. "Does it make you angry? Still?" "Yes," Clara said simply. "But angry and useless is just noise. Angry and skilled is something else." Ruth absorbed this the way she absorbed things she intended to keep. Then she picked up the yarrow again and asked another question about preparation quantities, and they went back to work, and the conversation folded itself into the lesson and stayed there, underneath it, in the way that the important things often do. They sat at that table until nearly 10 o'clock, and when they finally put everything away and closed the cabinet, Ruth stood and stretched and looked at the row of jars and bags and bottles with a new expression. Not ownership, but familiarity. The expression of someone who has just been given a key they didn't have before. "Same time Thursday?" she asked. "Same time Thursday," Clara said. Ruth nodded and went upstairs, and Clara sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen and thought about Ellen Holt saying her daughter would have made a good doctor, and thought about what Ruth might do with what she was learning, and what the world would make of a woman who knew this much, and decided that the world's opinions on the matter were secondary to the fact of the knowledge itself. Thursday came, and then the one after that, and the lessons accumulated, and Ruth accumulated with them. The change in Ruth was not the change of a person who has been convinced of something. It was the change of a person who has been given room. She was still sharp, still guarded, still the kind of 16-year-old who would challenge an assumption before accepting it. But the quality of her guardedness shifted. It was no longer directed inward, protecting her from disappointment. It turned outward, toward the things she was learning, as though she'd found something worth the energy of attention. She started noticing things about the other children with a new specificity. She mentioned to Clara that Daniel had been squinting at the supper table, and Clara watched him for a week and then told Gideon, and the next trip into Harlan Creek included a stop at the man who fitted spectacles, and Daniel came home with wire-rimmed glasses and the expression of someone who has just discovered that the world has edges. Ruth had noticed. Ruth had said something. That was new. Seth noticed the change in Ruth before the adults did, because siblings have a particular frequency of attention that adults have usually tuned out. He cornered Clara in the barn one afternoon. Not intentionally, he just appeared while she was there, which in Seth meant he wanted to talk and was providing himself a cover for it. Ruth's different, he said, examining a harness buckle that didn't need examining. Different how? Clara asked. Less like she's waiting for something to go wrong. Clara considered this. People change when they have something to do that uses what they're good at. Seth turned the buckle over. Like you? Clara looked at him sideways. What do you mean? You were different when you got here too, like you were waiting to see if it was safe. He said it without particular judgment, just reporting what he'd observed. You're not like that anymore. Clara was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I'm not. Seth put the buckle down. Will thinks you're the reason he's not dead. Will's being dramatic. Will's not, actually. Seth looked at her with the direct assessment that 12-year-olds deploy when they've decided to be honest. Pa thinks so too. He doesn't say it because Pa doesn't say things like that, but he thinks it. How do you know what your father thinks? Seth shrugged. I watch him. He watches you when he doesn't know you're looking. A beat. It's not weird. It's just, he looks at you the way he used to look at the ranch, like it's something he's responsible for, something he doesn't want to lose. Clara felt something move in her chest that she was not going to examine in a barn in front of a 12-year-old. Go do your chores, she said. Seth almost smiled. Yes, ma'am, he said, and went. Gideon Holt was not a man who talked around the edges of things indefinitely, which Clara had understood from early on. He was a man who worked through his thinking in private and arrived at a position, and then said the position plainly. The arriving just took him a while when the stakes were high. He arrived in the kitchen one evening near the end of the 5th week, after supper, after the children were in bed, after Agnes had gone to her room, at the point in the evening when the house was quiet in the way Clara had come to understand as truly quiet, not held breath, not waiting, but resting. Clara was at the table with her list. She had started a second notebook by this point because the first was nearly full, and the new one had sections: household, kitchen, garden, children's needs, things to order, things to repair, things to think about. It was an embarrassing document in certain ways, being evidence of how much she paid attention, but it was also simply what kept the household running, and she had stopped being embarrassed by useful things. Gideon pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and she looked up. He had the look on his face, the one that meant he had arrived somewhere and was about to say the position. I owe you something, he said. Clara set down her pen. You don't. I do. He put his hands flat on the table. When you came here, I treated this arrangement like a transaction. I don't mean I was unkind. I mean, I was thinking about what I needed and whether you could provide it. I wasn't thinking about you at all. Clara looked at him. That's what the arrangement was. It's what it was supposed to be, he said. It's not what it is. She held his gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. He was still working toward something. After Will's fever, Gideon said, and stopped. Started again. After that night, I sat with it for a week. What I felt in that room when the fever broke. And it wasn't just relief about Will, though it was that. It was... He pressed his hands harder on the table as though the table could help him. I've been watching you for 5 weeks. I've been watching how you are with my children and how you handled Agnes and how you stood in the kitchen when Pruitt's words reached you and how you were in that room all night with my son, and I kept telling myself I was just assessing whether this was working. Is it? Clara asked. That's not the question I'm asking myself anymore, he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the Montana wind was doing its persistent cold thing, and the house made the sound it made at night, and somewhere upstairs one of the children shifted in sleep. Gideon, she said, carefully, we have been in this house together for 5 weeks. You are a man who spent 14 months sealed off from the world, and I am a woman who spent 2 years becoming smaller than she is, and we are both. She paused. I don't want us to mistake gratitude for something else. or relief for something else. I know what gratitude feels like, he said. I'm not grateful. He exhaled. I'm paying attention to you, to who you actually are, and what I see when I pay attention is someone I didn't expect. Clara looked at her hands on the notebook. I didn't expect you either, she admitted. Gideon looked at her with those dark eyes that held their assessment back until they had enough to go on. And then, I'm not asking for anything right now. I just wanted you to know that I see you, not the arrangement, you. Clara felt the weight of that land in a specific place in her chest and stay there. All right, she said. He nodded once and stood and said goodnight and went to bed, and Clara sat in the kitchen for a long while after, not writing anything, just sitting with the thing he had said and what it meant that it had reached her the way it did. She thought about the letter she'd stopped reading, about the woman she'd been in Indiana, taking up less and less space, about the first morning on this porch when Agnes had said everything she'd said with that flat, carrying voice, and Clara had tightened her jaw and held her carpet bag and stayed. She had stayed because she had nowhere else that wanted her. But somewhere in the last 5 weeks that reason had changed, and she had not quite noticed when. Agnes noticed something had shifted between Gideon and Clara the way Agnes noticed most things. Sideways, without appearing to look, and with a private opinion she kept to herself until she had more data. She delivered the opinion on a Saturday morning while she and Clara were doing the wash together, standing over the tubs in the particular companionable misery of laundry day, which requires enough concentration to occupy the hands, but not enough to stop the mouth. He talked to you, Agnes said. Not a question. Yes, Clara said. Was it useful? Clara looked at her. Meaning what? Meaning did it clarify things or complicate them? Clara wrung out one of Thomas's shirts. Both, probably. Agnes nodded as though this confirmed something. He's a good man, she said, which from Agnes was not a small statement. He's not easy. He doesn't know how to ask for things without making it sound like he's just noting a fact. He works through his feelings the way he works through a problem. Alone, thoroughly, and later than ideal. I've noticed, Clara said. Ellen understood that about him. It took her 3 years. Agnes looked at the wash without seeing it. I'm not saying you're Ellen. I'm not saying you should be. She picked up another garment. I'm saying the man is worth the patience, that's all. Clara was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Agnes was quiet in return, for long enough that Clara thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, because I was wrong about you. From the beginning, I was wrong, and I don't admit that easily. And the least I can do when I've been wrong is say so directly. She looked at Clara. You belong here. I don't know when that became true, but it is. Clara stopped what she was doing and stood for a moment with the cold water on her hands and the Montana air around them, and the weight of those words doing what they did. Thank you, Agnes, she said. Don't make a thing of it, Agnes said and went back to the wash. Clara made a thing of it privately, in her own chest later. Some things deserve to be made a thing of, even if only internally. The shift in the household was perceptible after that, but it expressed itself quietly. It did not announce itself the way shifts do in stories. No single day when everything was different, no dramatic moment of transformation. It was in the small things, accumulated, the way everything in this house changed. Bea stopped following Clara at a 3-foot remove and started simply being wherever Clara was, as though the 3 feet had been about testing whether Clara would stay, and now that she'd confirmed it, the distance was no longer needed. She brought Clara things, rocks, a feather, once a very small mouse that was unfortunately deceased, with the gift-giving intensity of a child who has decided you are a person worth bringing things to. Thomas finished his second darning lesson and had moved on to a simple whip stitch, which he practiced on a piece of scrap canvas and took very seriously, the tip of his tongue always visible at the corner of his mouth. He had also, Clara noticed, stopped standing at the door of the sewing room. She didn't know what had changed. She didn't ask. Some things resolved themselves in children when the right conditions existed, and she had learned to notice without always needing to understand. Daniel, with his new glasses, became a different presence in the house. He had always been quiet, 5 years old, the second youngest, overshadowed by Bea's directness and the loud reality of 5 older siblings. With the glasses, he could see the faces of the people around him properly for the first time, and what this did was make him more present. He started making eye contact. He started offering opinions at dinner in a small, tentative voice that the table learned by unspoken agreement to make room for. He told Clara one morning that her hair looked like the color of fall when she had it loose. She thanked him. He considered this and added that he also liked the bread. She told him those were two of the nicest things anyone had said to her in a long while. He looked extremely pleased with himself and went to find his breakfast. The dinner table changed. Not suddenly, but over the weeks. The quality of what happened there shifted from the careful, managed quiet of the early days to something more genuinely alive. There were arguments, because families argue, and the arguments were real, which was better than the silence. Seth and Ruth disagreed about something at least twice a week with the particular venom of siblings who are fond of each other and too proud to say so. Thomas occasionally had opinions about food that he expressed with the complete conviction of someone who had darned 3 socks and thus earned the right to views on dinner. B contributed thoughts that were not always related to the conversation but were always interesting. Gideon let it happen. That was the thing Clara noticed about him, that he had a different quality at the dinner table now, less managed, less composed. He stopped eating to watch one of his children say something, and the watching had something genuine in it that had not been there in the first weeks. One evening Ruth said something that made Seth spill water laughing, and Gideon laughed too. Actually laughed, a real one, short but unmistakable. And the table went briefly quiet in the way a table goes quiet when something happens that nobody quite expected. And then everyone went back to eating, and Clara looked at her plate and thought, there it is. The letter from the matrimonial bureau arrived in the 6th week. It was a standard letter, a form of some kind, confirming the continuation of the arrangement or its dissolution, requiring Gideon's signature to proceed either way. It came to the ranch in the General Post, and Gideon brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table one evening, and Clara looked at it and understood immediately what it was. Gideon stood on the other side of the table and looked at it too. I haven't read it, he said. It's a continuation form, Clara said. She recognized the bureau's envelope. They send them at the 6-week mark. You sign it or you don't. Gideon looked at the envelope. What happens if I don't? The arrangement concludes, Clara said. I would be expected to return. She kept her voice even. Or to make other arrangements. He looked at her. Is that what you want? Clara held his gaze. No, she said. A pause in which the kitchen held the two of them, and the letter, and everything that had accumulated in the 6 weeks between the depot in Harlan Creek and this particular evening. Gideon picked up the letter and took it to the desk in the corner and found a pen and signed it without reading whatever it said, and sealed it back into the envelope and set it on the edge of the desk to go back with the next post. He didn't make a speech about it. He sat back down at the kitchen table and said, Is there more coffee? Clara got up and poured it. She set the cup in front of him, and he wrapped his hand around it and looked at her, and on his face was the open expression, the one she'd seen at 3 a.m. when the fever broke, and she thought, this is what he looks like when he's not managing anything. This is just him. Thank you, he said, for the coffee, maybe, or for other things. You're welcome, she said, and sat back down across from him. They sat in the kitchen while the house settled around them, and outside the Montana cold pressed against the windows, and upstairs the children slept, and somewhere in the house Agnes was going about her own evening in the particular way Agnes went about things, which was thoroughly and without fuss. Clara thought about the kitchen garden, about the turnips that had come up crooked and straightened themselves in their own time, which was not a metaphor she'd planned, but which seemed, sitting here on this particular evening, fairly apt. She thought about her mother's recipe book on the counter, about Ellen Holt's cabinet, about how you lived in a space and made it yours without taking it from anyone else, about how belonging was not a thing you were given, but a thing you built, and it was built out of exactly the kind of material that had been lying around this place for the past 6 weeks. The fixed chairs and the darned socks and the bread that rose right and the medicine that held a fever back and the conversation in the small hours on opposite sides of a child's bed. She thought about Bee's doll with its new button eye and how Bee had said she can see again and how Clara had thought, so can I. She opened her notebook and found the next blank page, and she started a new list, and this one was longer and less immediate than the list she'd been making. Not what to fix by Thursday, not what to order from town. This one was what she was thinking about for spring. The garden. What would go where? What the soil would need over the winter to be ready. What she'd plant first and in what order, and what she'd teach Bea and Thomas while they planted, and what the kitchen could do with fresh produce that it couldn't do with dried and preserved. It was a long list, and she was still writing when Gideon finished his coffee and said goodnight and went to bed, and she stayed at the table for another hour after that, planning a spring she intended to be here for. The first hard frost came on a Wednesday, which was also the day Clara found the kitchen garden frozen solid. She stood at the edge of it in the early morning with her coat pulled tight and looked at the ground and took stock without sentiment. The turnips had survived. Root vegetables were stubborn that way, insulated by the earth itself. But the late greens she'd put in were gone, flattened overnight into something dark and soft that wouldn't recover. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil and felt how deep the freeze had gone, and she thought, all right, that's what this winter is going to be. She was still there when Gideon came out of the barn and stopped when he saw her. Lost some of it? He called. The greens, she said. Turnips are fine. The soil held them. He came to stand at the edge of the garden beside her, and they both looked at what the frost had done, and the looking was companionable in a way that would have been impossible 7 weeks ago. They had arrived at something, not by talking about it directly, not by deciding, but by the accumulation of mornings and evenings and the particular honesty of the night Will's fever broke, and the letter on the desk with Gideon's signature, and the long list Clara had written about spring. The root vegetables will last us well into winter, she said, and I put up enough in the cellar in October that we won't be short. It's not what I'd have done if I'd had a full season, but it's not nothing. Gideon looked at the frozen garden. Next year, he said, simply, as though next year were already settled. Clara looked at him sideways. Next year, she agreed. They went inside, and the kitchen was warm with the breakfast Agnes had started, and the children came down in their particular order. Bea first and fast and already talking, Thomas behind her still tucking in his shirt. Daniel careful on the stairs in the way he'd been since he got his glasses, as though he was still adjusting to a world that had edges. Seth and Will arrived together, which had been the pattern since Will recovered, a closeness between them that the illness had shaken loose from wherever it had been waiting. Ruth came last, her hair already pinned, already carrying the day's competence in her posture, though it sat differently on her now, less like armor, more like something she chose to put on. Clara looked at all of them around that table and thought about the first dinner she'd sat through in this house. The managed silence, the careful distances, the 7 children arranged around their grief, like furniture around a hole in the floor. 8 weeks of mornings, and it looked like this now. Not perfect, not even close, but alive in the way that mattered. Bea knocked over her milk cup before the meal was halfway through, and the chaos of it, the scramble for cloths, the mild recrimination from Agnes, Bea's brief and sincere devastation, the way it resolved itself in 4 minutes, was so ordinary and so real that Clara sat in the middle of it and felt something she recognized as happiness, which was not the grand variety but the kind that settles in when you're not looking for it. The morning after the frost, Ruth came to the kitchen before anyone else was up. Clara heard her on the stairs and was already at the stove when Ruth appeared in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Ruth came in and sat at the table and put her elbows on it, which was something she never did because Ruth had very firm opinions about elbows at tables, and the elbows told Clara that this was going to be a real conversation. "I've been thinking," Ruth said. "About what?" Ruth looked at the table. "About what comes next. For me." She said it carefully, as though she'd been rehearsing the saying of it. "I've been running this house since Mama died. I'm not saying that I'm not complaining. I'm saying it because it's what I've been doing, and I know how to do it, and I know that I've been good at it." She looked up. "But I'm 16, and I've been thinking about the fact that I'm 16, and I've never... there are things I haven't done, things I want to do." Clara set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from her. "Tell me." Ruth's jaw shifted. "Dr. Harmon, in Billings, the one who came for Will, he said things about the body that I didn't know. He talked about it differently from your book, from Ellen's cabinet. He talked about it like a system, like a machine you could understand if you had the right information. She paused. He said, there's a school in Billings. They train nurses. Women can apply. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Have you told your father? Clara asked. No. Ruth's hands closed around her cup. He needs me here with... It's a lot of children, and you're... She stopped. Say it, Clara said. Ruth looked at her directly. You're not permanent, are you? The arrangement could still... people leave. Women leave this ranch. They always have. Clara held her gaze. Ruth, I know what you're going to say. I don't think you do, Clara said. I was going to say, tell your father what you want. Don't make yourself smaller than you are because you're afraid of what it costs other people. I did that for 2 years, and it cost me more than I saved anyone. Ruth was quiet. I am not going anywhere, Clara said. That's not a promise I make lightly. But more importantly, your staying here cannot be the thing that keeps me here, or the thing that keeps this house running. That's not fair to you, and it's not real. She leaned forward slightly. You have a mind that should be used. Your mother knew that. I know that. Tell your father. Ruth looked at her for a long moment, with those dark eyes that were so much like Gideon's and so entirely her own. What if he says no? Then we work on that, Clara said. Together. Ruth exhaled. It was the same exhale she'd done on that first late night in the kitchen, the release of something held, but longer this time, deeper. Okay, she said. Okay. She talked to Gideon that evening after supper in the front room while Clara kept the younger children occupied in the kitchen with a project involving cornmeal and varying degrees of mess. She did not hear the conversation. She heard the tone of it, not its words. And the tone went through several registers, including one that was tense and one that was quiet for a long time, and one that at the end was different from where it had started. Ruth came into the kitchen 20 minutes later with the expression of someone who has just done something difficult and found out they could survive it. He said he'd think about it, Ruth said. That's not no, Clara said. Ruth looked at her. He cried a little, she said, and the saying of it was careful, like something fragile. I don't think he meant me to see, but I did. Clara thought about Gideon and his sealed rooms and the particular cost of opening them. He's proud of you, she said. Crying is what proud looks like on a man who doesn't have another language for it. Ruth absorbed this. Then she looked at the cornmeal disaster Bea was creating on the kitchen table and said, What are they even making? I genuinely don't know, Clara said, but it's keeping them busy. Ruth sat down next to Bea and said, All right, what is this supposed to be? And Bea launched into an explanation that involved several fictional ingredients and a complete confidence in her own vision. And Ruth listened with the particular older sibling attention that was one of the things Clara had come to understand was one of Ruth's best qualities, the ability to take a small person seriously. Gideon came to find Clara after the children were in bed. He came into the kitchen and he sat down and he didn't say anything for a moment. And Clara poured coffee because coffee was the correct response to the expression on his face, and she sat across from him and waited. She wants to go to Billings, he said. I know. She told you first. She needed to say it out loud before she could say it to you. That's not a commentary on you, it's just how some things work. Gideon turned the coffee cup in his hands. She's 16. She's 16 and she's been running this house and raising your children, and she has a mind that can do more than manage a pantry, and she knows it, and you know it, and Ellen knew it. Clara kept her voice even. She's not going tomorrow. The school doesn't accept students until they're 18. You have 2 years. Gideon looked at his cup. 2 years goes fast. Yes, Clara said. So use them. She paused. Let her learn. Let her have something to work toward. And when she goes, let her go without guilt. Gideon was quiet for a long time, long enough that the kitchen clock made itself heard. Then Ellen would have wanted it. I expect she would have, Clara said. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man settling something in himself. I'll tell her yes in the morning. Clara felt something ease in her chest. She'll remember how you said it, she said quietly. For the rest of her life, she'll remember. Gideon looked up at that, and on his face was something raw and true, and he held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at his cup and said, How do you know things like that? I remember how my father said things, Clara said. The important ones. Word for word. He was quiet again. But it was the full kind of quiet, not the empty kind. He told Ruth at breakfast, and he did not make a speech of it. He said, "The school in Billings, we'll look into it properly, when you're ready." And Ruth, who did not cry easily, looked at her plate for a moment and then looked at her father and said, "Thank you, Papa," in a voice that was 16 and trying to be steady. And Gideon reached over and put his hand briefly on hers, and that was the whole of it, and Clara concentrated very carefully on her coffee. Seth looked at the ceiling, Will looked at his food, Thomas looked at Clara, and Clara looked back at him, and his expression said, "I don't entirely know what just happened, but it seemed significant," and she gave him the smallest possible nod, which seemed to satisfy him. B said, "Can I go to Billings too?" And the table exhaled. November came in behind the frost and settled in the way Montana winter settles. Not dramatically, but with total commitment, as though it intended to stay and was not interested in negotiation. The days shortened, the work shifted, the rhythms of the ranch changed shape around the season. Clara changed shape around it too. She had learned the ranch well enough by now to anticipate rather than react, to see what was coming and prepare rather than scrambling to catch up. This was satisfying in the specific way that competence is satisfying when you've worked hard enough to earn it and the work shows. She and Agnes had arrived at something that neither of them would have predicted from that first morning on the porch. It was not friendship, exactly. They were too different. Too much had gone before. But it was a genuine partnership, and it had a quality of respect that ran both ways, and had been earned rather than assumed. Agnes had stopped leaving coffee on fence posts and started handing it across directly, which was, Clara understood, an entire language in itself. One afternoon in the third week of November, Agnes came to find Clara in the kitchen garden where Clara was winterizing the beds, turning the soil, working in the compost she'd been building, covering the turnip rows against the hardest cold. Agnes stood at the edge and watched for a moment. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway," Clara said. Agnes's mouth adjusted slightly. "Why did you stay, really? At the beginning, when I made it clear you weren't wanted." Clara turned a spade of soil and thought about the question. "Because I didn't have anywhere better to go," she said. "And because the children needed someone, and because I was tired of shrinking." Agnes considered this. "Not because of Gideon." "Not at the beginning," Clara said. She straightened and looked at Agnes. "At the beginning it was just stubbornness and necessity. The rest came after." Agnes nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd suspected. "He's not good at saying things," she said. "Feelings, I mean. He works through them. He shows them by doing, not by speaking." "I've noticed," Clara said. "He fixed your window," Agnes said. Clara looked at her. "What?" "The window in the front room. The latch was broken when you arrived. It let cold air in one corner. He fixed it 2 weeks ago. Didn't say anything about it." Agnes's eyes held Clara's steadily. "That's how he says things." Clara thought about the window. She had noticed the cold air was gone. She had assumed she'd simply gotten used to it. She stood in the frozen garden and thought about a man who fixed windows without saying so, and about what it meant when someone paid attention to your comfort in the quiet way. In the way that didn't require acknowledgement, that just wanted the thing to be better. "Agnes," she said. "Don't make a thing of it," Agnes said, and walked back to the house. Clara made a thing of it, privately, again. She was building a collection of private things, and they were among the best things she had. That evening after supper, when Agnes had gone to her room and the children were occupied with various ends-of-day occupations, Clara went to Gideon in the front room where he was going through the winter accounts at the desk. He looked up when she came in. "You fixed the window," she said. Gideon looked at her and then looked back at his accounts. "Latch was broken." "It was broken when I arrived. You fixed it 2 weeks ago." A pause. Cold was getting in. "Gideon." He looked up again, and on his face was the expression of a man who has been found out in an act of care and is not sure how to carry it in the open. "It needed fixing," he said. "Thank you," Clara said. "Just that. No more." He held her gaze for a moment, and something moved in his expression. and he said, "Clara," in a voice that had the weight of everything that had been building since the depot in Harlan Creek, since the biscuits on the first night, since the kitchen table and the chair he sat in when he could have left, since 3 in the morning on opposite sides of a child's bed. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm not good at saying it." "I know that too." He stood up from the desk, and the distance between them in that room was very small, and he looked at her with all of it visible on his face. The grief that was still there because grief doesn't leave. It just finds a place, and the fear that was still there because he knew better than most people what could be lost. And underneath all of that, something that was not any of those things, that was its own thing, present and clear. "Stay," he said. The word he'd said before, weeks ago. But different now. Not a question about the arrangement. Not about the household or the children or the practical requirement of her presence. Clara looked at him. She thought about the woman she'd been in Indiana, getting smaller by degrees. She thought about the porch on the first morning, Agnes's voice carrying across the yard, the carpet bag in both hands. She thought about what she'd written on that first night in the kitchen. "This is what I have. This is where I start." And how far it had turned out to be from where she'd actually started, and how much further it had gone than she'd dared to plan for. She thought about the spring list in her notebook, about the garden, about Ruth going to Billings in 2 years with her sharp mind and everything Clara had taught her, about Thomas's careful stitches on a piece of scrap canvas, and Daniel's new glasses, and Bee's doll with its button eye restored, and Will eating 4 biscuits and Seth in the barn asking questions he was pretending not to ask, about Agnes handing coffee across directly, about a window with a fixed latch. "I already am," she said. Gideon's face did what it had been trying to do since the first evening she'd been in this kitchen. It opened fully without managing anything, and he reached across the small distance between them and took her hand and held it, and she let him. And they stood in the front room of the Holt Ranch while the Montana winter pressed cold and permanent against every window, and the house held them the way this house had been holding people for a long time, imperfectly and completely. He did not kiss her that night. This was not a story where everything resolved in one moment. He held her hand and they stood together in the quiet, and then he said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and they went their separate ways to their separate rooms. And that was right. Because some things need to be moved toward slowly when you've both been through what they'd been through, and the moving toward was its own kind of sweetness. But she lay in the front room, the room that was warmer now, the latch fixed, the cold kept out. And she listened to the house settle and thought about his hand around hers and thought, yes, this. December came, and with it the particular quality of cold that Montana produces when it means business, and the Holt Ranch pulled inward the way ranches do in winter, and life contracted to its essentials, which turned out to be more than enough. The kitchen became the center of everything, which suited Clara in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had not known, before this, that the thing she'd been missing was not a place or a person specifically, but the experience of being necessary in the way that was true. Not useful in the transactional sense, not convenient, but genuinely needed in a specific shape that nobody else could fill in quite the same way. She understood now, in a way she hadn't at 32 or 33, that belonging is not a feeling that arrives. It is a thing you build. And the building takes time and requires the specific materials of showing up and staying and doing the work, even when the work is not acknowledged, and continuing even when you make mistakes, and the house is cold, and the ground is wrong, and the things you plant come up crooked. It requires patience that costs something real. It requires honesty when softness would be easier. It requires seeing people as they are, and not as it would be more convenient for them to be. It requires letting people see you the same way, which is perhaps the hardest part, because being seen fully is an exposure that most of us spend considerable energy avoiding. Clara had not arrived at this understanding in Ohio or in Indiana or in any of the careful years that preceded the carpet bag and the letter and the long cold ride out to a ranch that hadn't wanted her. She had arrived at it here, in this kitchen, over 8 weeks and 7 children, and a fever, and a fixed window latch, and the particular education of living alongside people who needed her and resisted her and changed because of her and changed her in return. She wrote none of this in her notebook. Some things don't go in notebooks. Christmas was modest at the Holt Ranch. Not poor, the ranch had done well enough in the season, but modest in the way Gideon's nature produced, and in the way that people produce when they have spent a year learning the difference between what is necessary and what is extra. Clara made things with the children. She made things with each of them according to what they were capable of and interested in, and the process was more valuable than the products, which were charming and imperfect in the ways that handmade things for children always are. Thomas's contribution to the household gifts was a set of cloth pot holders that were slightly uneven and structurally sound, and he presented them with the satisfaction of someone who has produced a thing with his own hands and knows it, and Agnes accepted them with a gravity that was entirely sincere. Bea gave everyone drawings. She gave Clara a drawing of two people standing in a garden, rendered in the direct and slightly alarming style of a 4-year-old's art, and she said, "That's you and Papa," and went to give Daniel his. Clara looked at the drawing for a moment. In it, the two figures were approximately the same height, which was not accurate, and both appeared to have very large heads, which was typical of the genre, and they were standing next to something that might have been turnips or might have been trees, and they were side by side in the particular way that children draw people who belong together. She folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress. Gideon gave her something on Christmas morning privately before the household assembled, a small thing wrapped in cloth which she opened at the kitchen table while he stood nearby with the expression of a man who is not good at giving gifts and knows it. Inside was a key, a house key, iron, old, the key to the front door of the Holt Ranch. Clara looked at it in her palm. "The other one was Ellen's," Gideon said. "I had another made." He paused. "I should have done it the first week." Clara closed her hand around the key. She thought about everything she could say and chose the truest thing, which was also the simplest. "It's the best thing anyone's given me," she said. Gideon looked at her with his open face, the one she'd come to know as his real face, underneath the composure and the careful management. "You're not easy to give things to," he said. "You already have everything you need." "Not everything," Clara said, "but more than I came with." He almost smiled. It arrived this time. Not by much, not wide, but it was there, on Gideon Holt's face in the early morning light of a Montana Christmas, and it was directed at her, and she thought, "I will remember that for a long time." The winter passed the way winters pass when you are inside something real, not quickly, not slowly, but with a weight and texture that means it counts. By the time February came in with its particular brand of relentless cold, the house had settled into rhythms that were genuinely its own, not the rhythms of management or maintenance, but of people living together. Ruth sat with Clara twice a week and learned everything Clara could teach her and started, on her own initiative, keeping her own notebook. Seth took on more of the ranch work with a willingness that had not been there in November, as though something in him had decided to commit. Will, fully recovered and slightly more cautious than he had been before the fever, not afraid, just more aware, spent time in the kitchen with a frequency that Clara suspected was less about the kitchen and more about making sure she was still there, still present, and she let him, because that was what he needed, and it cost her nothing. Thomas finished a full piece of mending on his own and brought it to show her, and she held it and checked the tension and told him it was good work, and it was, and he went away with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has learned that they can make something hold. Agnes and Clara shared the kitchen the way two people share a space when they have genuinely learned each other, with the particular ease of people who no longer need to negotiate the boundaries because the boundaries are understood. There were still moments, there would always be moments, because they were both stubborn women with opinions, and that was fine, that was real. The moments didn't threaten anything anymore. And Gideon fixed things. He fixed the step on the back porch that had been listing since October. He fixed the hinge on the kitchen cabinet that made a sound every time it was opened. He fixed a shelf in the pantry that Clara hadn't mentioned because she didn't want to add to his list, which meant he had noticed it himself and had gone and fixed it without saying so. She started noticing the things he fixed and saying nothing, because the saying nothing was its own conversation, and they both knew it. In March, when the ground began, very slowly, and with no commitment, to soften at the edges, the first suggestion of something below the frost beginning to loosen, Clara went out to the kitchen garden in the early morning and stood at its edge and looked at what was there. The turnips had come through, battered by the winter, some of them split by the hard cold, but present. The ground had held them. She was still standing there when Gideon came out of the barn and stopped when he saw her. He crossed the yard and stood at the garden's edge beside her, and they stood in the early March cold together and looked at the ground that was beginning, very tentatively, to belong to spring. "The soil's better than it was," Clara said. "The winter worked it, and what I put in before the freeze, it's holding." Gideon looked at the garden. "What are you putting in first?" Clara looked at the ground. She thought about the list in her notebook, the long spring list she'd written on the evening of the signed letter, and everything it represented. The deliberate planning of someone who intended to be somewhere, who was not waiting to see if it was safe, who had decided. "Lettuce?" she said, "and then the beans, and then everything else." She paused. "And the flowers?" Gideon looked at her. "What kind?" "I don't know yet," she said. "The kind that does well here. The kind that likes this ground." She looked at the frozen soil that was beginning not to be frozen, and she thought about the woman who had cleared this garden and declared the ground was wrong and set about fixing it. "I want color," she said. "The window boxes have been empty long enough." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ellen liked larkspur," he said. "She tried every year. The soil was never right." "It will be this year," Clara said. He looked at her, and on his face was the full thing, the grief and the love and the present moment all at once, not separated, because they don't separate. That's not how it works. You carry the loss, and you also stand in the cold morning looking at the ground that is beginning to soften. And both of those things are true at the same time, and you learn to hold them both. "I know," he said. And she understood that he was not just talking about the larkspur. Clara looked at the kitchen garden, and then at the empty window boxes, and then at the house behind them, the house with the fixed latch and the key in her dresser, and the 7 children inside at various stages of their mornings, and Agnes at the kitchen stove, and the notebook with the spring list, and the recipe book with her mother's handwriting and all the knowledge it contained. She had come here carrying almost nothing, and had built something out of the carrying. That is what she would have said if anyone had asked. That the things that make a life worth living are not the things you are given, but the things you make out of what you have, out of the stubborn work and the honest seeing and the willingness to stay when staying is difficult, and be seen when being seen is frightening, and love people who are broken, and let yourself be loved when you are too. Nobody gave her this place. She did not win it. She did not earn it in a single dramatic moment. She built it with her hands and her knowledge, and her patience, and her imperfect, persistent, ordinary self. One day at a time, one fixed chair and one darn sock and one cup of coffee at a time, and it was hers because she had made it hers, and it would still be hers tomorrow. She reached down and pressed her fingers into the edge of the garden soil. It was cold, but underneath, just barely, she could feel the change, the ground giving slightly, the frost letting go. Spring was not here yet, but it was coming, and so was everything else.